Henry Caldwell stood at the edge of the grand ballroom, a glass of vintage Bordeaux in hand, the crimson liquid catching the light of the chandeliers overhead. At 58, he was a man carved from discipline, sharp jawline, graying temples, and eyes that held the weight of a lifetime spent climbing. Caldwell Innovations, his tech empire, had turned him into a titan, a name whispered in Silicon Valley boardrooms and printed in bold across Forbes covers. But tonight, in this gilded cage of wealth and whispers, he felt the familiar hollow ache beneath his tailored tuxedo, an emptiness no amount of money could fill. The room buzzed with the elite. CEOs in bespoke suits, heiresses dripping in diamonds, and the occasional politician flashing a practiced smile. Crystal clinked against crystal, laughter rose like smoke, and the air smelled of perfume and power. Henry scanned the crowd, his posture rigid, his mind already drifting to tomorrow's board meeting. He didn't belong here, not really. These were games for lesser men, men who measured worth in gossip and glances. Henry measured it in results. Still brooding, Caldwell? The voice cut through the din, smooth as a blade and twice as sharp. James Warner sauntered over, a smirk tugging at his lips, his dark hair slicked back with the confidence of a man who'd never known defeat. At least not until Henry had outperformed him a decade ago in a merger that still stung. James had been his rival since their Stanford days, a shadow Henry couldn't quite shake. Tonight he carried a glass of scotch and an air of provocation. "I don't brood, Warner," Henry replied, his tone even, controlled. "I think something you might try sometime." James chuckled, a low, mocking sound that grated against Henry's nerves. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Oh, I've been thinking about how far the mighty Henry Caldwell has fallen. All that power and what? A big house and no one to share it with. Tell me, what's honor worth when it's just you and your ego?" Henry's grip tightened on his glass, but his face remained a mask of calm. He'd mastered this, the art of swallowing venom without flinching. James knew how to prod, how to find the cracks. 30 years ago, Henry had walked away from Ellen, the woman who'd loved him when he had nothing, because he'd feared failure more than loneliness. He'd chosen ambition over family, and the cost was a silence that echoed louder than any boardroom applause. But he wouldn't give James the satisfaction of seeing that wound. "My honor's not up for debate, isn't it?" James raised an eyebrow, swirling his scotch. "Let's test that. A little wager for old time's sake. Prove your precious honor can buy anything. Marry someone, anyone, within 30 days. Make it a spectacle. Show us money, and pride can still dance together. Or admit you're just a hollow suit." The room seemed to hush, though Henry knew it was only in his mind. Faces turned, eyes glinted with curiosity. He could walk away, let James have his petty victory. But something in the challenge, the insinuation that his life amounted to nothing beyond his wealth, lit a spark of defiance. Henry Caldwell didn't lose. Not to James. Not to anyone. "Fine," he said, his voice steady as steel. "Name your terms." James grinned, triumphant. $1 million says you can't pull it off. Pick a stranger, someone who'd never fit in this world. Let's see if your honor bends." Henry set his glass down on a passing waiter's tray, his gaze sweeping the room. He needed someone unpolished, someone who'd make James eat his words. His eyes landed on her, a woman behind the bar wiping down the counter with a rag. She was younger, maybe early 30s, with dark hair tied back in a messy bun, and a face that held no trace of the room's artifice. Her hands moved with purpose, her posture straight, despite the faded black shirt and scuffed shoes. She didn't belong here any more than he truly did. "Her," Henry said, nodding toward the bartender. "She'll do." James followed his gaze, his smirk faltering for a split second before returning wider than ever. "Perfect. Let's see how long she lasts in your gilded cage." Henry crossed the room, the crowd parting like water before him. The woman, Nora, her name tag read, looked up as he approached, her hazel eyes narrowing slightly. She didn't smile, didn't fawn. She just watched him, steady and unflinching, like she'd seen men like him before and wasn't impressed. "Evening," Henry said, resting a hand on the bar. His voice was smooth, practiced. "I've got a proposition." Nora raised an eyebrow, tossing the rag over her shoulder. "I'm not pouring anything stronger than this," she said, nodding at the soda gun. Her tone was dry, edged with a quiet strength that caught him off guard. "Not a drink," Henry replied. "A deal. Marry me for 30 days. I'll pay. You enough to change your life, no strings beyond that." Her expression didn't shift, but something flickered in her eyes. Amusement, maybe, or disdain. "You're drunk," she said flatly. "I'm sober," he countered, "and serious. Name your price." Nora leaned forward, resting her elbows on the bar, her gaze piercing. "I don't sell my life to strangers, Suit. Not for any price." Henry didn't blink. $100,000. 1 month. You keep your freedom, I keep my word." She studied him, the hum of the ballroom fading into a distant buzz. For a moment he thought she'd laugh in his face. Then she straightened, wiping her hands on her apron. "Make it 200 and I'll think about it. I've got a kid to feed." "Done," Henry said without hesitation. 200,000 was nothing to him, a rounding error in his accounts. But the way she held his stare told him this wasn't about the money. Not entirely. "Name's Nora," she said, extending a hand. Her grip was firm, her skin rough against his manicured fingers. "Don't expect me to curtsy." "Henry Caldwell," he replied, releasing her hand. "Don't expect me to beg." Across the room, James raised his glass in a mock toast, his laughter cutting through the air. Henry ignored it, his focus locked on Nora. He'd win this wager, not for James, not for the money, but for the quiet, unshakable certainty that his honor, battered as it was, still meant something. But as Nora turned back to the bar, her silhouette, framed by the glittering lights, a whisper of doubt crept in. What had he just set in motion? The morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Henry Caldwell's San Francisco mansion, bathing the sleek marble floors in gold. The house was a masterpiece, 20,000 square feet of glass and steel perched on a cliff overlooking the bay. Every corner screamed success, the minimalist furniture imported from Italy, the abstract art worth more than most people's homes, the hum of a smart system controlling lights and temperature. But as Henry stood in the kitchen, still in his silk robe, the silence pressed against him like a weight. Success hadn't filled the emptiness. Nora arrived at 9 sharp, her beat-up sedan rattling into the driveway. Henry watched from the window as she stepped out, a duffel bag slung over one shoulder, her dark hair pulled back in that same messy bun. She didn't gawk at the mansion, didn't pause to take it in. She just marched to the door, her scuffed, sneakers leaving faint marks on the pristine stone steps. Ethan trailed behind her, a skinny 10-year-old with her hazel eyes and a backpack clutched to his chest. Henry's jaw tightened. He hadn't accounted for a kid. The doorbell chimed, a soft melodic sound that felt absurdly out of place. He opened the door, meeting Nora's steady gaze. "You're punctual," he said, stepping aside. "Habit," she replied, brushing past him. Her voice carried that same dry edge, but there was a warmth beneath it, worn and weathered like an old quilt. Ethan hovered close, peering up at Henry with a mix of curiosity and wariness. "This is Ethan. He's part of the deal." Henry nodded, keeping his expression neutral. "There's space upstairs. Pick a room." Nora didn't thank him. She just headed for the staircase, Ethan in tow, her steps echoing in the cavernous foyer. Henry watched them go, a flicker of unease stirring in his chest. This wasn't what he'd pictured, a mother and son disrupting his ordered world. But he'd made a wager, and Henry Caldwell didn't back down. By noon, Nora had claimed the kitchen. She stood at the granite island, a cheap coffee maker whirring beside her, its chipped plastic a stark contrast to the gleaming appliances. Henry lingered in the doorway, sipping his espresso from a porcelain cup. The smell of her brew, strong, unpretentious, cut through the sterile air. Ethan sat at the counter, scribbling in a notebook, his tongue poking out in concentration. "You didn't have to bring your own machine," Henry said, nodding. "At the coffee maker. I've got one built into the wall. Nora poured herself a mug, steam curling upward. Yours looks like it needs a manual. This one's reliable. She took a sip, then glanced at him. You always watch people like that? Like what? Like, you're sizing them up, figuring out what they cost. Henry's lips twitched, not quite a smile. Occupational hazard. You get used to it. She shrugged, leaning against the counter. Must be lonely. Pricing everything. The words landed harder than she'd intended. Or maybe she'd meant them to. Henry set his cup down, the clink sharp in the quiet. He could have brushed it off, kept the wall up. But something about her, the way she stood there unfazed by his wealth, sipping coffee like this was her kitchen, loosened a thread he'd kept tightly wound. Ever miss someone so much it hurts to breathe? The question slipped out before he could stop it, low and rough, a confession he hadn't meant to make. He regretted it instantly, but Nora didn't flinch. Yeah, she said softly, her eyes drifting to Ethan. Every day. But you keep going. Kids don't wait for you to figure it out. Henry followed her gaze. Ethan's pencil scratched against the paper, oblivious to the weight in the room. For a moment, Henry saw another face, Ellen's, 30 years younger, her blonde hair catching the sun as she laughed in a cramped apartment. He'd loved her once, fiercely, until ambition whispered louder than her voice. He'd walked away, telling himself it was for her sake, that he'd fail her if he stayed. The memory stung, sharp and unbidden. Who was she? Nora asked, pulling him back. Her tone wasn't prying, just curious, like she'd caught a glimpse of something he hadn't meant to show. No one. Henry lied, his voice steady again. Just a ghost. Nora didn't push. She turned back to her coffee, but her silence felt heavier than words. Henry straightened, smoothing his robe. He needed to regain control, to remind himself this was a transaction, a wager, not a therapy session. Anything you need, let me know, he said, pivoting toward the door. I'll be in my office. Ethan likes pancakes, she called, after him. If you've got flour, I can make some tomorrow. He paused, glancing back. I'll have my assistant stock the pantry. She nodded, a faint smirk tugging at her lips. Fancy. Henry left the kitchen, the echo of her voice, trailing him down the hall. Fancy. It was the first time in years someone had called him that without awe or envy. He climbed the stairs to his office, a glass-walled sanctuary overlooking the bay. The view was breathtaking, ships gliding across the water, the Golden Gate Bridge a distant sentinel. But today, it felt like a backdrop to something else. He sank into his leather chair, staring at the desk where contracts and awards sat in neat stacks. Nora's presence downstairs gnawed at him, a disruption he couldn't quantify. She wasn't like the polished women he'd known, executives and socialites who played the game. She was raw, real, a reminder of a life he'd left behind. Ellen flickered in his mind again, her soft blue eyes pleading as he packed his bags. You don't have to do this, Henry, she'd said. We're enough. But he hadn't believed her. He'd chased success, convinced it was honor, only to find it was a hollow crown. Nora's eyes weren't Ellen's, but they carried the same quiet strength. Henry rubbed his temples, pushing the thought away. This was about James, about proving a point. Nora was a means to an end, a pawn in a game he'd win with discipline, not sentiment. Yet as he opened his laptop, the faint sound of Ethan's laughter drifted up from the kitchen, mingling with Nora's low, steady voice. Henry froze, his chest tightening. For the first time in decades, his mansion didn't feel empty, and that scared him more than any wager ever could. The first headline hit on Monday morning, splashed across Henry Caldwell's inbox like a slap. Tech Titans sham marriage. CEO weds bartender in bizarre bet. By noon it was everywhere. Tabloids, financial blogs, even the Wall Street Journal's gossip column. The photo was grainy but unmistakable. Henry at the bar, shaking Nora's hand, her expression a mix of skepticism and resolve. The caption sneered, Caldwell's latest acquisition, a wife for a wager? Henry sat in his glass-walled office, the San Francisco skyline sprawling beyond the windows, a muted gray under a drizzle that matched his mood. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, poised to fire off a rebuttal. But he stopped. Anger wouldn't fix this. It never did. He leaned back in his leather chair, the hum of the radiator the only sound in the sterile space. Discipline had built his empire. It would weather this storm, too. Downstairs, Nora moved through the mansion like she'd always belonged there. Henry heard the clatter of pans as she cooked lunch for Ethan, her voice drifting up, a low, steady hum of a song he couldn't place. She hadn't mentioned the headlines, hadn't asked for an explanation. That unnerved him more than the press. Most people would have demanded answers, leveraged the chaos. Nora just kept going. His phone buzzed. James Warner's name flashed on the screen. Henry's jaw tightened, but he answered, his voice smooth as polished steel. "What do you want, James?" A chuckle crackled through the line. "Just checking. On my favorite philanthropist. Feeding the poor with your little charity case yet?" "She's not a case," Henry said, clipping each word. "She's a person." "Semantics," James drawled. "The board's buzzing, Henry. They're not thrilled their fearless leader's a punchline. I'd hate to see your legacy crumble over a barmaid." Henry's grip on the phone hardened, but his tone stayed level. "My legacy survived, worse than your cheap shots." "Not this time," James replied, his voice sharpening. "Meetings tomorrow. They'll want your head, or hers. Choose wisely." The call ended with a click, leaving Henry staring at the skyline. Rain streaked the glass, blurring the city into a smudge of lights. James wasn't wrong. The board had been restless since a shaky quarter, and this scandal was blood in the water. Henry could end it. Send Nora and Ethan packing, issue a statement, let the world assume it was a stunt. His honor would take a hit, but his company wouldn't. He stood, pacing to the window. The bay churned below, restless and gray. Honor. He'd staked his life on it, every deal, every sacrifice. 30 years ago, he'd walked away from Ellen to protect her from his failures, convinced success was the only dignity he could offer. Now James was testing that same resolve, daring him to bend. Henry wouldn't. Not yet. The office door creaked open. Nora stood there, her apron dusted with flour, a faint frown creasing her brow. "Ethan's napping," she said. "Thought you'd want to know the world's losing its mind out there." Henry turned, meeting her gaze. "You've seen it?" "Hard to miss," she said dryly, stepping inside. "My phone's buzzing off the hook. Friends, mostly. They think I've lost it." "And you?" he asked, his voice softer than he intended. "What do you think?" Nora crossed her arms, leaning against the doorframe. "I think you're in deeper than you planned. But I signed up for this. I'm not running." Her steadiness hit him like a quiet blow. He'd expected panic, maybe resentment. Instead, she stood there, unshaken, her hazel eyes holding his without a flicker of fear. It was the kind of strength he hadn't seen since Ellen, raw, unpolished, real. "You don't have to stay," he said, testing her. "I can handle the fallout," she snorted, a sound halfway between amusement and defiance. "And let you win your bet alone? Nah. Ethan's got a roof over his head because of this. I'll ride it out." Henry nodded, a flicker of respect warming the cold edges of his resolve. Fair enough. The rain picked up, drumming against the glass. He glanced out, memories tugging at him. Ellen's voice, soft and desperate, begging him not to leave. "We're enough, Henry." He hadn't listened. Now here he was, a king in a castle, defending a crown that felt heavier every day. "Storm's getting worse," Nora said, breaking his reverie. She hesitated, then stepped closer, pulling a folded handkerchief from her apron pocket. "You're soaked. Stood out there too long." Henry blinked, realizing his shirt clung damply to his shoulders. He'd walked the grounds that morning, lost in thought, the rain a distant annoyance. He took the handkerchief, a plain, faded thing, nothing like the monogrammed linens in his drawers, and wiped his face. "Thanks," he muttered. She shrugged, turning to leave, but paused at the door. You're not what I expected, you know. Most rich guys would have yelled by now. I don't yell, Henry said, folding the cloth neatly. Doesn't solve anything. Nora's lips twitched, almost a smile. Good to know. She left, her footsteps fading down the hall. Henry stood there, the handkerchief still in his hand, its faint scent of coffee and flour lingering. He crossed to his desk, sinking into the chair, the weight of the day settling deeper. Tomorrow's board meeting loomed, a crucible of judgment. James would be there smirking, ready to twist the knife. The shareholders would demand explanations, maybe his resignation. He could still walk away clean, cut Nora loose, salvage his image. But as he stared at the rain-slicked window, Ethan's laughter from earlier echoed in his mind. Bright, unguarded, a sound his mansion hadn't known in decades. Nora's quiet defiance echoed too, her presence a tether to something he'd lost. Honor wasn't just winning the wager, it was keeping his word, even when the world laughed. He opened his laptop, drafting an email to his PR team. No denials, no apologies. We stand by the truth. Then he leaned back, the storm raging outside, his resolve hardening within. James wanted a fight. Henry would give him one, not with fists or fury, but with the steady, unshakable dignity he'd spent a lifetime forging. Downstairs, Nora's song rose again, faint but clear, weaving through the silence. Henry closed, his eyes letting it linger. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. Henry Caldwell stood at the edge of his office, the San Francisco skyline a muted blur beyond the rain-streaked glass. Tuesday had dawned gray and heavy, the storm lingering like an unwelcome guest. The board meeting loomed hours away, a gauntlet of scrutiny he'd face with the same steely resolve that had built Caldwell Innovations. But the headlines still gnawed at him. CEO's wager wife, tech mogul's midlife crisis. Each one a jab at the honor he'd spent decades defending. He'd survived worse. He'd survived this. Downstairs, the mansion hummed with a softer rhythm. Nora's presence had seeped into the space. Pancake batter sizzling on the griddle that morning, Ethan's crayons scattered across the dining table. Henry had watched them from the doorway, Nora flipping pancakes with a practiced hand, Ethan giggling as syrup dripped onto his shirt. It was mundane, messy, alive. His sterile world hadn't known such sounds since Ellen. The thought tightened his chest, but he pushed it down, focusing on the day ahead. He was halfway through a briefing memo when a faint creak pulled him from the screen. Nora stood in the office doorway, a small wooden box in her hands, weathered, unremarkable, the kind thrift stores sold for $1. Her apron was gone, replaced by a faded sweater, and her expression was guarded, almost hesitant. "Found this in my bag," she said, stepping inside. Ethan was digging around. "Wanted to show you something." Henry's brow furrowed. "What is it?" Nora set the box on his desk, flipping the lid open. Inside lay a stack of letters, yellowed and creased, tied with a frayed ribbon. She untied it, pulling one free, her fingers careful as if handling glass. "They're old, been meaning to sort them, but..." She trailed off, handing him the envelope. Henry took it, his pulse quickening for no reason he could name. The handwriting on the front was achingly familiar. Slanted, delicate, a ghost from 30 years past. Ellen. His breath caught, sharp and sudden, as he traced the ink. "Where did you get this?" His voice came out rougher than he'd intended. Nora didn't flinch. "My sister's things. She passed a few years back. These were hers, from our mom." "Your mom?" Henry's mind raced, pieces clicking into place too fast, too jagged. He opened the letter, unfolding it with hands that trembled despite his will. The date read 1995, 5 years after he'd left Ellen. The words blurred at first, then sharpened into a quiet, piercing clarity. "Henry, I don't know if you'll ever read this. I hope you're happy, wherever you are. Katie's growing fast, 5 now, asks about her dad sometimes. I tell her you're out there, building something big. Maybe that's true. I forgive you, you know. Always will. Ellen. Katie. Ellen's daughter. Henry's daughter. The realization hit like a slow, heavy wave, drowning him in its wake. He'd known Ellen was pregnant when he left, had begged her to let him go, convinced he'd drag her down if he stayed. She'd never told him about Katie, never tracked him down. And now, your sister, he said, barely a whisper, looking up at Nora. Katie. Nora nodded, her eyes steady but soft. Yeah, Ethan's her son, my nephew. Mom, Ellen, raised us both after Katie. After she was gone, Henry sank into his chair, the letter slipping from his fingers onto the desk. Ethan was his grandson, the boy downstairs, with Ellen's hazel eyes and that unguarded laugh, was his blood. And Nora, Ellen's other daughter, the one he'd never known, stood before him, a living bridge to a past he'd buried under ambition and pride. Why didn't you say anything? His voice cracked, but he held it together, clinging to the control that had always saved him. Didn't know it was you, Nora replied, crossing her arms. Not at first. Mom never talked about you much, just said you were someone who chose a different path. When I saw your name in the news, I wondered. Then I saw you up close. You've got her jawline, you know. Henry touched his face instinctively, a reflex born of shock. Ellen's jawline. He remembered tracing it with his fingers back when. Love was enough, before he'd convinced himself it wasn't. I didn't know about Katie, he said, the words tasting like ash. She never told me she kept the baby. She didn't want you to stay out of guilt, Nora said quietly. That's what she told me. Said you had dreams she couldn't hold back. Dreams. Henry's throat burned. Dreams that had built, towers of glass and steel that had won him accolades and wealth, but left him alone in this gleaming prison. He'd thought walking away was honor, sparing Ellen a life of struggle. Now he saw it for what it was, cowardice dressed as sacrifice. I'm sorry, he said, the words foreign on his tongue. He met Nora's gaze, searching for anger, blame, anything to lash out against. But her eyes held only understanding, weathered and deep. Don't be, she said. Mom didn't hate you. She forgave you. Ethan doesn't even know yet. Just thinks I'm his crazy aunt who took him in. Henry glanced at the box, the stack of letters a silent testament to a life he'd missed. Does he need to know? Not unless you want him to, Nora replied, her voice firm but kind. This isn't about dragging up the past, it's about now. Ethan's got a roof because of you. That's enough for me. She turned to leave, but Henry stopped her. Nora. She looked back, waiting. Thank you for keeping them. Her lips curved, a faint, sad smile. Someone had to. When she was gone, Henry sat there, the letter in his lap, the office silent save for the rain's steady tap. The board meeting waited, an arena of judgment where James would wield this scandal like a blade. But it paled against the weight of Ellen's words, Katie's existence, Ethan's laughter echoing below. He'd made a wager to prove his honor to James, to the world. Now it stared back at him from a faded envelope, asking a harder question. What was his honor worth if it had cost him a family? Henry folded the letter, tucking it into his pocket. He'd face the board, James, the press, but first he'd face himself. Downstairs, Nora's voice called Ethan to lunch. Henry closed his eyes, letting it wash over him, a sound he hadn't earned, but one he wouldn't let slip away again. Henry Caldwell stood at the head of the mahogany conference table, the San Francisco skyline a brooding gray through the tinted windows of Caldwell Innovations' boardroom. The air was thick with tension, 11 board members in tailored suits, their faces a gallery of skepticism and impatience. The headlines had done their damage. CEO's wager sparks stock dip. Caldwell's personal circus threatens. Empire. Shares had slipped 3% overnight, a bruise on Henry's pristine record. He adjusted his tie, his movements deliberate, his expression a mask of calm. Control was his armor, and he wouldn't shed it now. James Warner lounged. At the table's far end, his dark eyes glinting with the smugness of a predator scenting blood. He'd arrived early, whispering to the directors, planting seeds of doubt. Henry had known James since their Stanford days. Brilliant, ruthless, and perpetually envious. A decade ago, Henry's merger triumph had left James scrambling, and the grudge had festered ever since. Today, James wore a crisp navy suit and a smile that promised trouble. "Gentlemen," Henry began, his voice steady, resonant. "You've seen the reports. Let's address them." Chairman Richard Hale, a silver-haired veteran with a voice like gravel, leaned forward. "Address them? Henry, your little stunt's a liability. We're bleeding value while you play house." "With a bartender," murmurs rippled through the room. Henry's jaw tightened, but he kept his tone even. "It's not a stunt. It's a commitment. The market will stabilize once the noise dies down." James chuckled, a low, cutting sound. "A commitment? To what? Proving you're a fool? I hear she's got a kid, too. What's next, Henry? A minivan?" He slid a tablet across the table, a new headline glowing. "Caldwell's wife. A pawn in bet. Sources say child involved." The room stilled. Henry's pulse thudded, but he didn't flinch. He'd expected James to twist the knife. This was just sharper than anticipated. "Sources," he said coolly, "are often wrong. Nora's not a pawn, she's my wife legally and willingly." "Willingly?" James leaned back, crossing his arms. "Or paid. Come on, Henry, we're not idiots. You're drowning in this mess and now you've dragged a kid into it. Tell me, how's that honor holding up?" The jab landed, a barb aimed. At the secret Henry still carried. Ellen's letter. Ethan's lineage. He could feel the board's eyes boring into him, weighing his silence. Anger simmered beneath his ribs, hot and sharp. But he swallowed it. Dignity didn't roar. It stood firm. "My honor," he said, meeting James's gaze, "is intact. Yours I'm less sure about." A few directors shifted uncomfortably. James smirked, undeterred. "Prove it. End this charade. Send her packing. Issue a statement. Or step down before we vote you out." Hale raised a hand, silencing the room. "Enough, Warner. Henry, you've got a week to fix this. Stocks don't care about your pride. Results do." The meeting adjourned, a storm breaking, into uneasy murmurs. James lingered, tossing Henry a mock salute before sauntering out. Henry stayed behind, alone with the hum of the HVAC and the weight of Hale's ultimatum. A week. 7 days to salvage his company or lose it. Not to James's taunts, but to the cold math of the market. He drove home through the drizzle, the city lights smearing across his windshield. The mansion loomed ahead, its glass facade a silent sentinel. Inside, Nora sat at the kitchen island, a mug of tea cradled in her hands. Ethan sprawled on the floor nearby, battling a math worksheet, his pencil tapping a restless rhythm. The scene was ordinary grounding, a stark contrast to the boardroom's sterile chaos. "You're late," Nora said, glancing up. Her tone was neutral, but her eyes searched his, catching the strain he couldn't hide. "Board meeting," Henry replied, shedding his coat. He sank into a chair across from her, the ache in his shoulders deeper than he'd admit. "They're not happy," she nodded, unsurprised. "Saw the news. They're calling Ethan a prop now. Nice touch." Henry winced, the words cutting deeper than James's barbs. "I didn't plan this." "Didn't think you did," she said, sipping her tea. "But it's hitting him. Kids at school asked if I'm a gold digger today. He didn't know what to say." Guilt twisted in Henry's gut, sharp and unfamiliar. He glanced at Ethan, who looked up, offering a shy grin before returning to his numbers. Those hazel eyes, Ellen's eyes, held no blame, only trust. "I'll fix it," Henry said, more to himself than her. Nora set her mug down, studying him. "You don't have to. We can leave. You keep your bet, your company. Ethan and I'll manage." The offer hung there, simple and selfless. Henry could take it, cut the cord, reclaim his solitude, let James gloat. But the thought of the mansion empty again, of Ethan's laughter fading, anchored him. "No," he said firmly. "You're staying. This isn't just about the wager anymore. She tilted her head, a flicker of curiosity in her gaze. Then what is it about? He didn't answer. Not fully. It's about doing what's right. Nora didn't press. She stood, crossing to the stove where a kettle simmered. You're wiped, she said, pouring hot water into a second mug. She slid it toward him. Black tea, no frills, the steam curling between them. Drink. You look like you need it. Henry took it, the warmth seeping into his palms. You don't have to have it, she cut in, echoing her first words to him. A faint smile tugged at her lips, softening the edges of the day. He sipped the tea, the bitterness grounding him. Ellen flickered in his mind, her hands wrapping around a chipped mug, her voice teasing him for working too late. Nora wasn't Ellen, but she carried that same quiet strength, a lifeline he hadn't known he needed. Ethan yawned, rubbing his eyes. Can I go to bed? He mumbled. Go on, Nora said, ruffling his hair. I'll check your homework later. The boy shuffled off, leaving them in a companionable silence. Henry watched Nora tidy up, her movements steady, unhurried. James's words echoed. You're drowning. But here, in this kitchen, he felt like he was surfacing. I'm not stepping down, he said, breaking the quiet. Not for him, not for anyone. Nora glanced back, her eyes sharp but warm. Good. You're not the quitting type. Henry nodded, the tea mug warm against his hands. James wanted a war. Henry would fight, not with rage, but with the dignity he'd forged through years of sacrifice, and this time he wouldn't fight alone. Henry Caldwell drove north out of San Francisco, the city's glass towers fading in the rearview mirror as the road wound toward Marin County. The drizzle had softened to a mist, cloaking the hills in a silver haze. Nora sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the passing pines. Ethan sprawled in the back seat, headphones on, lost in a handheld game. Henry had suggested the outing on impulse, a break from the headlines, the board's ultimatum, James's taunts. He'd chosen Lake Tamalpais, a place Ellen had loved, without fully understanding why. Now, with Nora's wooden letterbox tucked in the trunk, the weight of it pressed against him. The lake came into view, a still expanse of water framed by redwoods, its surface mirroring the clouded sky. Henry parked near the shore, the gravel crunching under the tires. Ethan bolted out, racing to the water's edge with a gleeful shout, while Nora lingered by the car, her sweater pulled tight against the chill. Henry joined her, the box in his, hands its worn edges rough against his palms. Mom liked it here, Nora said, her voice low, almost lost in the wind. She'd bring us when things got tough, said it cleared her head. Henry nodded, his throat tight. He remembered Ellen's laugh echoing across this same lake, her blonde hair catching the sun as they picnicked on a blanket, young and broke, but happy. That was before he'd chosen ambition over her, before he'd walked away with promises he never kept. She always had a way of finding peace, he said, the words rough with memory. Nora glanced at him, her hazel eyes sharp but gentle. You're different when you talk about her, less guarded. He didn't reply, just set the box on the hood of the car and opened it. The letters spilled out, Ellen's handwriting a lifeline to a past he'd buried. He'd read only one, but its weight had haunted him for days. Nora watched, silent, as he pulled another free, the paper brittle under his fingers. The date read 2005, 10 years after the first. Henry. Katie's 15 now, stubborn as you. She's asking questions I can't answer. I tell her you're a good man who made hard choices. Ethan's here too, her boy, my grandson. He's got your eyes, I'm not mad anymore. I just hope you're okay. Ellen. Henry's breath hitched, the words slicing through him like a blade. Ethan, his grandson, had been born years before Ellen's death, a life unfolding without him. He looked up at Nora, his voice barely a whisper. You knew all this? Not everything, she said, stepping closer. Mom kept most of it quiet. I pieced it together after she passed, found the letters, figured out you were the Henry she wouldn't name. I didn't know for sure until I saw you, He turned away, walking to the lake's edge, the letter clutched in his hand. Ethan skipped stones nearby, oblivious, his small figure a mirror of innocence Henry had lost. The water lapped at the shore, steady and unyielding, and Henry felt the ground shift beneath him. Ellen had forgiven him, had raised their daughter, their grandson, alone. While he'd built a fortune and called it honor, the irony burned. "Nora," he said, his voice breaking as he faced her. "Tell me the rest, all of it." She hesitated, then joined him, her boots crunching on the gravel. Katie got sick young, cancer, fast and brutal. She was 20 when she had Ethan, 22 when she died. Mom took him in, raised him like her own. She wrote those letters hoping you'd come back someday, but she never sent them. Said you'd earned your life, whatever it was. Henry's knees buckled, but he caught himself gripping a nearby tree. The bark bit into his palm, grounding him as the truth sank in. Katie, his daughter, gone. Ellen gone. And Ethan, the boy laughing 10 feet away, was all that remained of them. Tears stung his eyes, hot and unbidden, the first he'd shed in decades. He didn't wipe them away. "She forgave me," he murmured, staring at the letter. "Why?" "Because she loved you," Nora said simply, her voice steady but thick. "Even after you left. She thought you'd find your way back eventually. When you didn't, she made peace with it." Henry sank to the ground, the damp earth, soaking through his slacks. The letter slipped from his fingers, fluttering to the grass. Ellen's forgiveness was a gift he didn't deserve, a grace that shattered the walls he'd built around his pride. He'd walked away to protect her, to prove himself, but all he'd proven was how much he could lose. Nora knelt beside him, resting a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to carry it alone anymore," she said. "Ethan doesn't know yet, but he's here. You're here." He looked at her, her face blurred through his tears. "I don't know how to fix this." "You don't fix it," she replied, her grip firm. "You live it, one day at a time." Ethan's shout broke the moment, drawing their eyes. "Look, Aunt Nora, 5 skips." He grinned, waving a flat stone, his joy cutting through the heaviness like sunlight. Henry forced a smile, wiping his face with his sleeve. "Good one." "Kid," he called, his voice ragged but warm. Nora stood, offering him a hand. He took it, rising slowly, the lake stretching before them, a quiet witness to his unraveling. The board's deadline, James's threats, the wager, they faded against this truth. He'd fought for honor in boardrooms, but it lived here in Ellen's words, in Ethan's laughter, in Nora's unwavering presence. "I'm not running from this," he said, more to himself than her. "Not anymore." Nora nodded, a flicker of approval in her eyes. "Good, because Ethan's a terrible fisherman and I'm betting you know a thing or two about it." Henry chuckled, a raw, shaky sound, the first real laugh he'd felt in years. "I might." They walked back to Ethan, the mist settling around them. The wager with James had started this, a petty game of pride. But as Henry picked up a stone and handed it to Ethan, showing him how to angle his wrist, he knew it wasn't about James anymore. It was about reclaiming what he'd lost, not with money or power, but with the dignity to face his past. The lake shimmered, holding Ellen's memory, and Henry vowed silently he'd keep this family, whatever it took. Henry Caldwell stood in the boardroom of Caldwell Innovations, the San Francisco skyline, a muted glow behind the rain-slicked windows. Wednesday morning had arrived with a vengeance. The storm raging outside mirrored the one, brewing within these walls. The board sat arrayed before him, 11 stern faces framed by the mahogany table, their eyes sharp with judgment. James Warner leaned back at the far end, his navy suit pristine, his smirk a blade honed for the kill. The clock ticked toward the end of Henry's week-long grace period, and the air crackled with the weight of what came next. Chairman Richard Hale cleared his throat, his gravelly voice cutting through the tension. "Henry, your time's up. Stocks are down another 2%. This arrangement of yours is bleeding us dry. Explain yourself." Henry adjusted his cufflinks, a deliberate motion that steadied his hands. He'd spent the night by Lake Tamalpais in his mind, Ellen's letters spread across his desk, Ethan's laughter echoing from downstairs, Nora's steady gaze grounding him. He'd faced the truth there, and it had forged something unbreakable within him. He met Hale's stare, his voice calm, resonant. "I'm not here to explain, I'm here to decide." Murmurs rippled through the room. James straightened, sensing an opening. "Decide? You don't get to decide, Caldwell. You've turned this company into a soap opera. Your little family stunts cost us millions." Henry's pulse thudded, but his face remained a mask of control. He could feel the heat of James's words, the venom behind them. Family stunt. It struck at Ethan, at Norah, at the fragile thread of redemption he'd grasped by the lake. Anger flared, hot and fleeting, but he crushed it. Dignity didn't lash out, it stood firm. "The cost," he said, his tone even, "is temporary. The company's strong enough to weather it. You know that, James." "Do I?" James slid a folder across the table, its contents spilling out. Printouts of headlines, stock charts plunging. Read. "The board doesn't share your optimism. Neither do I. I've got a deal on the table. Merge with Warner Tech, stabilize the market. You step aside, and we all win, except maybe your barmaid and her brat." The room stilled, the insult hanging like smoke. Henry's hands clenched briefly, then relaxed. He glanced at the folder, then back at James, his gaze unyielding. "Her name's Norah, and that brat is my grandson." A collective gasp broke the silence. Shocked whispers, wide eyes. Henry hadn't planned to say it, but the words felt right. A quiet defiance that stripped James's taunt of its power. Hale raised a hand, silencing the room. "Grandson? Explain that, Henry." Henry took a breath, steadying himself. 30 years ago, I left someone, Ellen, Ethan's grandmother. I didn't know she had a daughter, Katie, or that Katie had Ethan. Nora's their family, my family. I found out last week. This wager started as a game, but it's not anymore. It's about them." James laughed, a harsh barking sound. "Oh, this is rich. You expect us to buy this sob story? You're weak, Henry, clinging to some kid to save your ego. Step down, or I'll make sure the press buries you. CEO's secret love child scandal. How's that sound?" The threat landed, heavy and real. Henry saw the board shift, some skeptical, some intrigued, all waiting. He could fold, send Nora and Ethan away, take James's deal, preserve his legacy. It'd be clean, clinical, the kind of choice he'd made 1,000 times. But as Ellen's forgiveness echoed in his mind, "I hope you're okay," he knew that legacy was hollow without them. "No," Henry said, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "I'm not stepping down, and I'm not taking your deal. This company's mine, built on my work, my choices. If you want me out, vote me out. But I won't bend to you, James." Hale's eyes narrowed. "You're gambling everything, Henry." "For what?" "For what's right," Henry replied, unwavering. "Nora and Ethan aren't pawns, they're family. I've spent 30 years chasing honor in this room. It's out there now with them." James surged to his feet, his composure cracking. "You're delusional. You think this board will back a sentimental fool over profit? You're finished." Henry met his glare, calm as stone. "Maybe, but I'll walk out with my head up. Can you say the same?" The room held its breath. Hale rubbed his temples, then nodded. "We'll vote tomorrow. Prepare yourself, Henry." The meeting dissolved, directors filing out in a murmur of disbelief. James lingered, his smirk gone, replaced by a flicker of unease. Henry ignored him, gathering his papers with steady hands. He'd rolled the dice, not for power, but for the dignity to stand by his word. When he returned to the mansion, dusk had settled, the bay a dark shimmer beyond the windows. Nora sat at the kitchen table, a book open, her tea gone cold. Ethan's snores drifted from upstairs. She looked up as Henry entered, her brow furrowing at the strain in his eyes. "Rough day?" she asked, her tone light but searching. "Could say that," Henry replied, sinking into a chair. His coat stayed on, a shield he wasn't ready to shed. "They want me out." James offered a deal. Merge the company, Ditch you two. I said no. Nora's lips parted, surprise softening her face. You didn't have to do that. Yeah, I did, he said, his voice low, firm. You're not a bargaining chip. Neither's Ethan. She studied him, then stood, crossing to the counter. You're stubborn as hell, you know that? She pulled a mug from the cupboard, filling it with hot water from the kettle, and slid it toward him. Black tea. No fuss, like always. Henry took it, the warmth seeping into his hands. Runs in the family, I hear. Nora's mouth twitched, a faint smile breaking through. Guess so. He sipped the tea, the bitterness steadying him. James's threat loomed. I'll bury you. But it paled against the quiet here. Nora's presence, Ethan's snores, the life he'd stumbled into. He'd chosen them over the empire, not out of weakness, but strength. The kind Ellen had seen in him once, the kind he'd forgotten until now. Whatever happens tomorrow, he said, meeting her gaze. I'm not letting go. Not this time. Nora nodded, her eyes warm with something like pride. Good. Ethan's counting on those fishing lessons. Henry chuckled, the sound easing the ache in his chest. The board could take his title. James could take his shot. But this was his to keep. Henry Caldwell woke to the sound of rain tapping against the mansion's windows, a soft, persistent rhythm that matched the ache in his chest. Thursday morning had arrived, the day the board would vote, the day his fate as CEO of Caldwell Innovations would be sealed. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling's sleek lines, Ellen's letters vivid in his mind. Yesterday's stand in the boardroom had been a gamble, not for power, but for the honor he'd rediscovered by the lake. Now the consequences loomed, and he faced them with a calm he hadn't known in years. Downstairs the kitchen glowed with the muted light of dawn. Nora stood at the counter, slicing apples, her movements steady and unhurried. Ethan sat cross-legged, on the floor, assembling a puzzle, his tongue poking out in concentration. The scene was a quiet anchor, a stark contrast to the storm Henry had weathered, and the one still brewing. He paused in the doorway, watching them, the weight of his choice settling deeper. Morning, Nora said without looking up, her voice warm but edged with fatigue. Coffee's on. You look like you need it. Henry crossed to the pot, pouring a mug, the steam curling upward. Didn't sleep much, he admitted, his tone rough. Big day. She glanced at him, her hazel eyes catching the strain he suwakes. Couldn't hide. They're voting, huh? Yeah, he said, sipping the coffee. Could go either way. Nora nodded, setting the knife down. You did what you could. That's what counts. Her words, simple and steady, eased the knot in his chest. He'd spent a lifetime measuring worth in outcomes, deals won, stocks soared. But here, with Nora's quiet faith and Ethan's puzzle pieces scattered across the floor, he saw a different metric. The dignity to stand by what mattered. He set the mug down, ready to reply, when Ethan piped up. Aunt Nora, where's that letter you were reading? The boy's voice was casual, his focus still on the puzzle. Nora stiffened, just for a moment, then forced a smile. In my bag, kiddo. Don't worry about it. Henry's brow furrowed. What letter? It's nothing, she said quickly, turning back to the apples, too quickly. Nora, he pressed, his voice low but firm. What's he talking about? She sighed, wiping her hands on a towel, then crossed to her duffel bag by the couch. Ethan watched, curious, as she pulled out a single sheet of paper. Newer than Ellen's letters, its edges crisp. She handed it to Henry, her expression tight. Found it last night. Wasn't sure when to show you. Henry unfolded it, his pulse quickening. The letterhead read, Global Tech Solutions. A rival, firm he'd courted years ago. Dated 2 years prior, it was an offer, a senior project manager role for Nora, based in London, with a salary that dwarfed her bartending wages. The closing line chilled him. We regret to hear of your family circumstances, but hope you'll reconsider. You turned this down, he said, looking up, his voice thick with realization. Why? Nora shrugged, avoiding his gaze. Ethan needed me. Katie was gone. Mom was sick. Couldn't drag a kid across the ocean. Henry stared at the letter, the pieces falling into place. 2 years ago, Ellen's final days, Ethan orphaned, Nora stepping in. She'd sacrificed a career, a fresh start, to keep her nephew safe. The weight of her choice hit him like a wave. Silent, selfless, a mirror to the life he'd built on walking away. You could have gone, he said softer now. After Ellen passed. Could have, she agreed, meeting his eyes at last. Didn't. He's family. You don't leave family. The words pierced him, echoing Ellen's forgiveness, Katie's absence, his own decades of absence. Nora had chosen Ethan over ambition, everything he hadn't done. He folded the letter, handing it back, his throat tight. You're a better person than I ever was. She took it, her lips twitching into a faint smile. Not better, just different. Ethan looked up, tilting his head. Aunt Nora, are you leaving? No, buddy, she said, ruffling his hair. Not going anywhere. Henry watched them, the boy's trust in her unwavering, and felt a resolve solidify within him. He'd fought for his company, for his honor. But this was bigger. I'm stepping down, he said, the decision spilling out, clear and final. After the vote, whatever they decide, I'm done. Nora's eyes widened. Henry, I mean it, he cut in, his voice steady. I've got enough money, enough years. Ethan's my grandson. You're his guardian. I'm not losing this again. She stared at him, then nodded slowly, a flicker of respect in her gaze. Okay. What's next? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he drove to the boardroom, the letter's weight lingering in his mind. The vote was swift, 6-5 against him, James's triumph sealed with a smug nod. Henry stood, unshaken, and announced his resignation before they could enforce it. I built this company, he said, his voice ringing clear. I'm leaving it in your hands. Make it worth something. James rose, his smirk faltering. You're walking away? Just like that? No, Henry said, meeting his gaze. I'm walking toward something. You wouldn't understand. He left the room, the city's hum fading behind him. Back at the mansion, he found Nora and Ethan in the kitchen, the boys' puzzle nearly complete. It's over, he said, shedding his coat. I'm out. Nora handed him a mug of tea, her touch brief but warm. You sure? Yeah, he said, sipping it. I'm starting a fund, Ellen's name, for kids like Ethan. Scholarships, homes. You and him, you're staying here. She blinked, then smiled, a real one, soft and rare. Guess we're stuck with you. Ethan grinned, holding up the finished puzzle, a lake scene, like Tamalpais. Look, Henry, we did it. Henry knelt beside him, ruffling his hair. We sure did, kid. The doorbell rang. Nora answered, returning with James Warner in tow, his expression uneasy. Came to gloat? Henry asked, rising, his tone calm. No, James said, shifting. Came to say you're a stubborn bastard, and I'm sorry. You've got something I don't. Always did. Henry nodded, a quiet truce. Take care of the company. James left, the rain easing outside. Henry sat with Nora and Ethan, the mansion no longer a shell, but a home. He'd lost the title, the wager, but gained a legacy worth keeping. Henry Caldwell woke to the soft patter of rain against the mansion's windows, a gentle farewell to the storm that had shadowed the past week. Friday morning arrived with a quiet promise, the San Francisco Bay glinting silver beyond the glass. He lay still for a moment, the weight of his resignation settling, not as a loss, but as a release. Caldwell Innovations was behind him, a chapter closed with dignity intact. Ahead lay something new, something real. Nora, Ethan, a family he'd reclaimed from the ashes of his past. He rose, slipping into a sweater and slacks, the formal suits left hanging in the closet like relics of a former life. Downstairs, the kitchen hummed with life. Nora stood at the stove, flipping pancakes, the scent of syrup and butter filling the air. Ethan sat at the island, legs swinging, a smear of maple on his cheek as he chattered about fishing. Henry paused in the doorway, the scene washing over him, a balm to the hollow years he'd spent chasing shadows. "Morning," he said, stepping in. His voice carried a warmth he hadn't noticed before, softer than the clipped tones of boardrooms. Nora glanced back, her hazel eyes catching the light. "You're up early. Thought you'd sleep in after yesterday." "Old habits," Henry replied, pouring coffee from her chipped machine. He'd grown to prefer its bitter simplicity over the espresso contraption gathering dust. "Besides, I've got plans." Ethan perked up, wiping his mouth with his sleeve. "Fishing plans?" Henry chuckled, setting his mug down. "Soon, kid. First pancakes." He slid into a chair beside Ethan, accepting a plate from Nora with a nod. The first bite was warm, sweet, a taste of home he'd forgotten existed. They ate in companionable silence, the rain's rhythm a backdrop to Ethan's, occasional giggles and Nora's dry quips. Henry watched them, marveling at how easily they'd woven into his life. A week ago, he'd been a man alone, tethered to a wager and a title. Now the mansion felt lived in, crayons on the table, a sweater draped over a chair, Nora's quiet, presence anchoring it all. He'd lost the company but gained this, a trade he'd make again without hesitation. After breakfast, Henry cleared the plates, waving off Nora's protest. "You cooked," he said. "I clean. Fair's fair." She smirked, leaning against the counter. "You're getting soft, Caldwell." "Call it wisdom," he shot back, rinsing a dish. Ethan darted off to grab his fishing gear, leaving them alone. Henry glanced at Nora, her arms crossed, her expression unguarded for once. "I meant what I said yesterday. You're staying. Both of you." Her smirk faded, replaced by a flicker of something deeper, gratitude maybe, or trust. "You didn't have to give it all up, you know. The job, the company." "Didn't give it up," he said, drying his hands. "Gave it back. Built it for 30 years. Someone else can steer it now. I've got enough to do here." She nodded, her eyes softening. "Ethan's lucky to have you." Henry's chest tightened, Ellen's forgiveness echoing in his mind. "I hope you're okay." "I'm the lucky one," he said quietly. "Should've been here sooner." Nora didn't reply, just handed him a fresh mug of tea, a silent acknowledgement. They stood there, the kitchen warm with the afterglow of breakfast, until Ethan burst in, rod in hand. "Can we go now, please?" Henry laughed, the sound freer than it'd been in decades. "Grab your jacket. Lake's waiting." They drove, to Tamalpais, the mist lifting to reveal a sky streaked with gold. The lake shimmered, a mirror to the peace settling in Henry's bones. He taught Ethan to cast, guiding his small hands, the boy's excitement infectious. Nora sat on a blanket, nearby sketching the scene, her pencil scratching softly against the paper. Henry caught her eye once, her smile brief but real, a shared understanding of this fragile, precious moment. Back at the mansion, Henry finalized his plans. He'd spent the morning on calls, setting up the Ellen Caldwell Foundation, scholarships, housing, support for kids like Ethan who'd lost too much too soon. The money flowed easily, decades of wealth redirected to a purpose beyond himself. Nora watched from the couch as he hung up with his lawyer, her sketchbook open on her lap. "That's a big move," she said, nodding at the phone. "Ellen'd be proud." "She'd have done it herself," Henry replied, settling beside her. "I'm just catching up." Ethan bounded over, clutching a finished drawing, a shaky lake with 3 stick figures labeled me, Aunt Nora, Henry. "Look, it's us!" Henry took it, his throat tight. "It's perfect, kid, we'll frame it." The day faded into evening, the rain gone, leaving a crisp clarity outside. Henry cooked dinner, simple spaghetti, a recipe Ellen had taught him long ago. Nora teased his technique, Ethan slurped noodles with abandon, and the kitchen filled with laughter. It wasn't grand, wasn't polished, but it was theirs. Later, as Ethan slept upstairs, Henry and Nora sat by the fireplace, the crackle of logs a soft accompaniment to their silence. The press had shifted. Caldwell steps down, starts legacy fund, painting him as a hero, not a fool. But Henry didn't care. The world's noise couldn't touch this. You won, you know, Nora said, breaking the quiet. Not the bet maybe, but something bigger. Henry smiled, faint but genuine. Didn't win. Found. Took me long enough. She nodded, her gaze warm. Better late than never. He leaned back, the fire's glow dancing across the room. Ellen's letters rested on the mantel, a quiet testament to the past he'd faced. Katie's absence ached, but Ethan's presence healed, a bridge across the years. Nora was the guardian who'd held it together, and Henry was the man who'd finally come home. I'm teaching him to fish tomorrow, he said. Properly this time. Good, Nora replied. He's counting on it. Henry closed his eyes, the mansion no longer a monument but a haven. He'd kept his word, not to James, not to the board, but to himself, to Ellen, to this family. He'd earned through loss and grace. The lights of serenity weren't in the skyline anymore. They were here, in the laughter upstairs, the tea on the table, the life he'd chosen at last.